let's now talk about the second seal. John says, "And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him." Is this a literal horse? And rider? And sword that goes around making war with people? No. So what does it symbolize? Well, the color is red, which is usually used in the Bible as the color for blood or bloodshed. In war, that's always the result, the bloodshed of other people. What this seal is describing is war. Does anyone want to take a guess where in history there was a war within John's immediate future? That's right. The Jewish War. Before I share some of Josephus' writings with you guys, let me remind you again of what Daniel said would take place after the Messiah would be cut off. That prophecy is found in Daniel. Daniel 9:26. "Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined." If you've watched my Matthew 24 video, you would know that what Daniel's referring to here is not only the death of Christ, but also of the Jewish war, where by the end of it, the city of Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed and desolated by the Roman armies in 70 AD. Let's now look at what Josephus said took place during that period of time. Josephus wrote, "Now the people of Caesarea had slain the Jews that were among them on the very same day and hour when the soldiers were slain, which one would think must have come to pass by the direction of providence, insomuch that in 1 hour's time above 20,000 Jews were killed, and all Caesarea was emptied of its Jewish inhabitants. For Florus caught such as ran away, and sent them in bonds to the galleys. Upon which stroke that the Jews received at Caesarea, the whole nation was greatly enraged. So they divided themselves into several parties, and laid waste the villages of the Syrians, and their neighboring cities, Philadelphia, and Sebonitis, and Gerasa, and Pella, and Scythopolis, and after them Gadara, and Hippos, and falling upon Gaulonitis, some cities they destroyed there, and some they set on fire, and then went to Kedasa, belonging to the Tyrians, and to Ptolemies, and to Gaba, and to Caesarea. Nor was either Sebaste, Samaria, or Ascalon able to oppose the violence with which they were attacked. And when they had burnt these to the ground, they entirely demolished Anthedon and Gaza. Many also of the villages that were about every one of those cities were plundered, and an immense slaughter was made of the men who were caught in them." This is found in Josephus' Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 18, Paragraph 1. So it looks like the Jews divided themselves into different warring parties against other neighboring cities. This sure sounds like peace being removed to me. Let's look at another one of his writings. "However, the Syrians were even with the Jews in the multitude of the men whom they slew, for they killed those whom they caught in their cities, and that not only out of the hatred they bare them, as formerly, but to prevent the danger under which they were from them, so that the disorders in all Syria were terrible, and every city was divided into 2 armies, and camped one against another. And the preservation of the one party was in the destruction of the other. So the daytime was spent in shedding of blood, and the night in fear, which was of the 2 the more terrible. For when the Syrians thought they had ruined the Jews, they had the Judaizers in suspicion also. And as each side did not care to slay those whom they only suspected on the other, so did they greatly fear them when they were mingled with the other, as if they were certainly foreigners. Moreover, greediness of gain was a provocation to kill the opposite party, even to such as had of old appeared very mild and gentle towards them. For they, without fear, plundered the effects of the slain, and carried off the spoils of those whom they slew to their own houses, as if they had been gained in a set battle. And he was esteemed a man of honor who got the greatest share, as having prevailed over the greatest number of his enemies. It was then common to see cities filled with dead bodies, still lying unburied, and those of old men mixed with infants, all dead, and scattered about together. Women also lay amongst them, without any covering for their nakedness. You might then see the whole province full of inexpressible calamities, while the dread of still more barbarous practices which were threatened was everywhere greater than what had been already perpetrated. This is found in the Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 18, Paragraph 2. Josephus said, "The daytime was spent in shedding of blood, and the night in fear, which was of the two more terrible." The red horse equals bloodshed, and bloodshed occurred during the Jewish war. Spending the night in fear equals no peace, as the second seal said. The second seal represents the war, the bloodshed, and the fear that arose as a result of the Jewish war. But Waldy, the second seal has to do with the conquering of the Antichrist against the nations. There is no future Antichrist, and there is no future time where he will conquer the Jews while fighting other nations. That's found nowhere in Scripture, and it's certainly not found here. Let's now look at the third seal. John says, "I looked and behold a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine.'" What could this mean? The color black is often associated with darkness or suffering. I'm convinced that what the seal is describing is famine. As this says. A denarius was a day's wages for labor back in biblical times. So what this seal is saying is that a famine was unleashed that was so bad to the point where an entire day's wages would only get you a small piece of wheat and barley. In other words, food was extremely scarce and hard to find. As for where it says, "Do not damage the oil and the wine," these two things, I'm convinced, are referring to the rich. Oil and wine in biblical times were things that were commonly associated with the rich. So in this seal, although the famine was severe, the rich would still be rich and attempt to keep the luxuries they had, and the poor became even poorer due to not having much already. Question now is, do we see examples of such a famine in Josephus's writings? Indeed we do. Josephus says, "But as for the richer sort, it proved all one to them whether they stayed in the city or attempted to get out of it, for they were equally destroyed in both cases. For every such person was put to death under this pretense, that they were going to desert, but in reality that the robbers might get what they had. The madness of the seditious did also increase together with their famine, and both those miseries were every day inflamed more and more. For there was no corn which anywhere appeared publicly, but the robbers came running into, and searched men's private houses. And then, if they found any, they tormented them, because they had denied they had any. And if they found none, they tormented them worse, because they supposed they had more carefully concealed it. The indication they made use of whether they had any or not was taken from the bodies of these miserable wretches, which if they were in good case, they supposed they were in no want at all of food, but if they were wasted away, they walked off without searching any further, nor did they think it proper to kill such as these, because they saw they would very soon die of themselves for want of food. Many there were indeed who sold what they had for one measure. It was of wheat if they were of the richer sort, but of barley if they were poorer. When these had so done, they shut themselves up in the inmost rooms of their houses, and ate the corn they had gotten. Some did it without grinding it, by reason of the extremity of the want they were in, and others baked bread of it, according as necessity and fear dictated to them. A table was nowhere laid for a distinct meal, but they snatched the bread out of the fire, half-baked, and ate it very hastily. This is found in Josephus' Jewish War, Book 5, Chapter 10, Paragraph 2. Josephus says, but as for the richer sort, that they were going to desert, but in reality that the robbers might get what they had. John says, do not touch the oil and the wine. Josephus says, it was of wheat if they were of the richer sort, but of barley if they were poorer. John says, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Josephus writes of this huge famine that overtook Jerusalem during the Jewish War, and he brings mention of it multiple times. I'm convinced that that is what this third seal represents. Let's now look at the fourth seal. John says, I looked and behold an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. The word for ashen here literally means sickly pale. This color, of course, represents the color of a person the color that a person looks like once they are dead. This makes sense since John mentions that the writer is deaf and that Hades follows him, and that they killed 1/4 of the earth with the sword and famine and pestilence and wild beasts. There's 3 things that we need to address here. Firstly, are Death and Hades literal riders on horses? No. Death is not a person, nor is Hades. Death is the end of a human life, and Hades is the grave, where the wicked go. So they're not literal people that are going around killing other people. Secondly, the text says that they killed over 1/4 of the earth. Is this number literal? I don't believe so. We've had no reason to believe so far that the numbers used in Revelation to describe certain things are in the literal sense. 1/4 here could simply mean a small amount, while also not being a complete amount. 1/4 is 1 less than half. So while it's still a significant portion, it's still only that, a portion. Thirdly, when John says the word earth here, is he referring to the entire world as we know it? Is he referring to every single place on earth upon every single nation? I don't believe so. The Greek word for earth here can also be translated as land. It is not a quote-unquote better translation. They're both just as good. The problem stems from the modern-day English language. When the word earth is used in present-day English, it can mean one of 2 things. The earth being, the dirt of the ground, where plants grow, or the earth being the whole planet Earth. We don't typically use the word earth when referring to a piece of land or a specific region of a nation. Because of this, the word land would benefit us more here, if indeed it's referring to the land of Jerusalem during the time of the Jewish war. I have good evidence to believe that land is the more beneficial word choice here, and for the rest of this chapter, based on the historical evidence found in Josephus. Here they are. Start with this first one. Thus did the miseries of Jerusalem grow worse and worse every day, and the seditious were still more irritated by the calamities they were under, even while the famine preyed upon themselves after it had preyed upon the people. And indeed the multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps one upon another was a horrible sight, and produced a pestilential stench, which was a hindrance to those that would make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy. This is found in Josephus' Jewish War, Book 6, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1. Josephus says, even while the famine preyed upon themselves. John says, death by famine. Josephus says, a multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps one upon another. John says, a significant number of people died. Josephus says, the bodies produced a pestilential stench. According to John, death produced pestilence. But Waldy, what about the beasts of the earth? Is that symbolic too? Well, check this out. Josephus writes, Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by the sword and by the wild beasts. But those that were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. This is found in Josephus, Book 6, Chapter 9, Paragraph 2. Josephus says, destroyed by the sword. John says they will kill by the sword. Josephus says, destroyed by the wild beasts. John said they would kill by the wild beasts of the earth. This seal is symbolic of the many ways people would die during the Jewish war. Waldy, I'm not convinced of that number being symbolic. How many people actually died during that time? Josephus gives us an estimate. He writes, now the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation with the citizens of Jerusalem, but not belonging to the city itself, for they were come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which, at the very first, occasioned so great a straitness among them, that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterwards such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly. This is found in Josephus' Jewish War, Book 6, Chapter 9, Paragraph 3. Josephus says 1,100,000 of them died. In modern day English, that number is 1,100,000. That's a significant amount to me. But even then, this is the number of how many had died by the end of the war. So I'd imagine that the other means of death outside of the Roman armies would have killed a significant fraction of Jews in Jerusalem before then. Josephus describes these events as a pestilential destruction, and that afterward, a great famine came and destroyed them more suddenly. Let's bring back up those 97,000 captives real quick. Does this sound familiar to anyone? What did Jesus have to say about this time period? Let's take a look at that. Jesus says in Luke 21, verses 23 to 24, "Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be a great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Jesus himself said that many would be led captive into all the nations. Josephus gives us an estimated number for how many there were. Is this all still a coincidence? I'm not convinced that it is. Jesus said that wrath would come upon this people, meaning that same generation of unbelieving Jews. He said they would be killed by the sword and would be led captive. That's exactly what Josephus said took place in the Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD. Some of you might be wondering, Waldy, how can we know for sure that what took place in the Jewish war was God bringing judgment down to the unbelieving Jews of Jerusalem that Jesus spoke about? For what reason would God need to do that at that time rather than any other time? What were they guilty of that would require such a judgment? Well, in this next seal, we'll be describing all of that in detail.